Today's interview is with Terry Moore. My name is Bob Rindy, and this oral history interview is generally about Gold 10, but we will certainly delve into other issues as they come up. Why don't you begin, Terry, by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your background in planning and what your particular background has been with the statewide land use program.
Okay, a quick background in planning. I had an undergraduate degree in engineering and went to Peace Corps and got retrained as a planner in community development in Honduras, and came back.
What year time frame was that?
That would be 71 through 73. And came back and decided to take planning up as a profession. Went to graduate school and got degrees in both planning and public administration. And worked for a year at Portland Metro at the time when Metro was just being created. And then with one of my university professors, ended up joining him to create the consulting company ECONorthwest, which then started doing business for real in about 1980. And since 1980, I've been a project manager at ECONorthwest, working on planning projects, primarily in the Northwest, but eventually as we got bigger around the country, and have done quite a bit of work on transportation and land use issues in particular, and the intersection of planning with the economics and real estate economics. My involvement with the land use program goes back quite a ways. Actually, in graduate school, I showed up at one of the first ever LCDC meetings when L.B. Day was still there, and watched him.
What year might that have been about?
That would be about 1977, 76, 77. And got a real eyeful of how that public process worked, and then I realized that when I was really watching L.B. Day, Peter Watt, I don't know if you remember that name, was
Certainly
one of the original planners of the DLCD, and had done something which seemed fine to me, and L.B. Day was not satisfied with it and excoriated Peter in public about that. And I go, whoa, so this is how planning works in Oregon.
And so that was a meeting in Salem.
That was actually, they were going around the state. It was a meeting in Eugene.
Oh, that was DC.
I was down at the University of Oregon. So that was my first involvement. Another part, one of my classmates there was Maggie Collins, and Maggie had been around at the start of all this. So I got some background on that, on the program from Maggie as we were putting things together. But once we got involved in the consulting business, a lot of the work that I wanted to do was related to things that LCDC and DLCD was working on. So
you were working for Metro, and you said around 77?
No, that would be about 79.
79, okay. Where I was going, Terry, is trying to get a sense about what point you were involved. I know you were involved with the urban growth boundary planning, and perhaps some housing planning as part of that.
A little bit of the housing. My original job at Metro, among other things I was doing, was trying to help local governments in the Portland metropolitan area comply with the goals and get their plans acknowledged. And coming out of graduate school and being more quantitative, I said, well, where's the checklist? So I tried to develop a checklist, and which seemed very logical to me, and in fact was logical.
For just the housing goal or for all the goals?
All the goals,
Wow.
Every goal. And what I think what I learned in that process was just how fuzzy the goals were, and how, in some sense, fuzzy the goals had to be. People with more experience than I had at that point at DLCD were very worried about the checklist, because the checklist sort of, I think to them, implied that if you checked all the boxes, then you were acknowledged. And they saw it as a more complicated and qualitative process than that.
And so the checklist saw the light of day as a Metro product or something that...
Yeah, it came out as a Metro product, and DLCD looked at it a little bit, and we used it for a while to try to see if we were going to say that the plans were okay or not.
I see.
But I wasn't there for very long, and I don't think it lasted very long after I left.
So can you tell us about some of the issues as the local governments and regional government worked to incorporate the housing goal into their comp plans?
Well, sure. A little bit of background there. Because my firm, ECONorthwest, was primarily an economics firm doing planning, we tended to come at housing from an economic perspective. And so we would get questions about, is there a market for this type of housing? Whereas other firms would get the question of, in some ideal sense, what type of housing would we put where if we wanted to create livability, et cetera? We understood those questions, were maybe capable of working on them, but didn't have the penmanship to allow us to work on design issues. So other firms would do that work. But we'd get called in for the occasional market analysis, and as Goal 10 got more and more fleshed out, as the Goal 10 housing rule came up, and there were requirements for data, then we were often involved in that type of thing. So over the years, we probably worked on certainly dozens of housing needs analyses under the Goal 10 regulations.
Which at first would have been fairly new kinds of things. So you were developing those for Metro and the context of Metro during the early days when...
Well, I think, again, I won't get the timing exactly right, but I left Metro about 1980. What I'll call the Metro planning rule, the housing rule for the metropolitan area, that I think primarily Greg Winterroad at DLCD was the chief architect of, working with Metro to get that deal put together. That was going on, I would say, it seems to me like the early 80s. And it feels to me like it wasn't until 1990 that we're doing the, expanding the housing goal and coming up with the housing needs analysis and all of that stuff. So at that time, at the time that the housing goal was being put together, I think there wasn't as much quantitative analysis. It was, but as with everything, in any organization, and I'll use the term bureaucracy not in the pejorative sense, but just as rules get established, as you move from the idealistic stage of, let's just get something done, to, oops, we saw what happened there, let's put something in place to take care of that. The rules evolved, and eventually there was a need, at least a perceived need, for an administrative rule on Goal 10 to get that stuff straightened out. And a lot of people thought that was true, and how exactly are we going to measure this stuff? And it's no coincidence, I think, that the program was maturing, the data were getting developed, GIS was coming into play, it was more possible to do more work, and as it became more possible, it also became more required. And you got the inevitable, I'll call it a problem, but you could see it as an opportunity, that you are increasing your standards, you're increasing the requirements for how you're going to evaluate against those standards. And I would say that that's what the Goal 10 rule started to do. And then there was, we worked on developing the first guidebook that went with that, on trying to divide out the Goal 10 into a supply side analysis of buildable land and a demand side analysis, and how would you do the supply side and the demand side analysis. And then that evolved eventually in about the mid-90s, when the Department of Housing and Community Services got involved, and they started creating models that then went to DLCD, and there were a few years there when there was a reference to the housing model that was being used to generate demand side analysis and debates about that issue.
I vaguely recall that Housing and Community Services in the early days, and to me, I got involved about 1980 with the department. The housing department would produce long-range demand analysis. Maybe that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I know they stopped doing that at some point. It wasn't feasible. But a lot of the conflict in those early days, like you say, was about what exactly is the rule. And the metro housing rule was adopted about 1980, 81, and then a statewide rule, similar, but not quite as detailed. And that rule, the metro rule, came out of the metro's own analysis for region-wide housing needs. And the result was then that cities had some really hard and fast standards if they were in metro, 27 cities and counties up there, 6, 8, 10, 50% of their allowed housing for the future had to be attached or multifamily. I wasn't around when those notions came about. Were you involved in the development of that, in Metro's standards?
No, I wasn't at Metro at that time, and I wasn't involved in that part of the process. I didn't really get involved in the housing stuff until the Goal 10 administrative rule came out, and there was an effort on DLCD's part to try to set up guidance for local jurisdictions on how they would comply with that administrative rule. There's a comment that I will make on that, though, that I think is germane, and that is that I think you described it correctly in that the goal itself and then the rule was really about trying to get more multifamily housing. That was the emphasis. And in the other thing, I'm going to mention my background. The other thing I've done is, for a lot of my career, as you know, taught also at the University of Oregon. So I've got one foot in academia and tend to read academic articles on this stuff. One piece written is called, a book called Zoned Out. And the thesis of that, pretty well documented, is that a lot of the problems that what Oregon would consider problems of lack of livability, lack of concentration, and to say the word lack of density, are not market failures as much as they are failures of public policy, and that public policy has in fact, in order to protect the perceived quality of life of existing property owners, has zoned a lot of things single family, and does that as a defensive measure to keep multifamily out. So there's a lot of evidence that what Metro and DLCD were working on was a real problem. And they worked on that problem, they got that rule in, and then we waited to see what would happen. And then, to finish the story, in about, I'd say about 10 years ago, 2007, 2008, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, probably the most prestigious national think tank on land use issues, got together a bunch of people, including me, to do a study of smart growth planning in the United States. And we looked at 8 case studies, 4 of which were smart growth states, one of which was Oregon, and 4 of which were states that were trying to do good things but didn't have any centralized planning, Colorado, New Jersey. And we looked at about a dozen issues, one of which was affordable housing. And it's a long-winded story, but I'm getting close to the punchline now, Bob. The study there was pretty rigorous, and what it found was that in the 4 smart growth states, housing was less affordable on a number of measures than in the 4 non-smart growth states. And it also found that Oregon did the best job of getting multifamily housing, but Oregon did a very poor job of getting affordable housing or of getting renter-owned housing, whereas New Jersey, that had a program that was aimed at affordable housing, did a good job at affordable housing. So the point that I'm getting to is that by focusing on multifamily housing, by setting our policy about multifamily housing, we got multifamily housing, but we did not at the same time say that multifamily housing will be for renters and that multifamily housing will be for low-income people. You and I are sitting now in Portland, Oregon, where a lot of multifamily housing has been built over the last 6 years since the recession, and a lot of that multifamily housing is not affordable. It is, it's in condominiums that are not, for renters until the next recession hits. So the point that I'm making is what you measure is what you'll get, and I think the metro housing rule ultimately was successful in getting what it aimed at, and I think it was good that it aimed at what it did, but it only got what it aimed for.
Well, and so that's good, because that was the next question I was supposed to talk about is, how do you think we did in implementing Goal 10, we being the state, did we achieve Goal 10 to encourage adequate numbers of housing units at price ranges and rent levels that people could afford? And I think you've addressed that just now in talking about that study, but I did want to talk about the fact that another aspect of the land use program is the urban growth boundary, and I think it's commonly believed that in order to meet that goal, Goal 14, generally lot sizes would get smaller, allowed lot sizes, and more density, which doesn't translate to multifamily, but perhaps translates to more affordable housing. Was that also addressed by the Lincoln studies or by other things you've looked into?
Parts of it were, parts of it are addressed elsewhere. I think it's, I'm not sure what let me ask the question, Bob. Do I have time just to kind of ramble on and talk about it the way that
Yeah, because we have an hour at least, okay, Terry, so we can go on it.
Okay, well then I'll just kind of lay this out for posterity.
Perfect.
I typically start with just a little bit of theory. If you talk to any urban economist, they will say if you put something in short supply and the demand increases, those two things are going to increase price. So a conundrum for any planning program is that our objective is to make things more livable, more quality of life, and I will call that better. And at the same time we're making them better, we are going to restrict the supply of land within urban growth boundary for all the reasons that have been articulated and that a lot of people believe in, and I probably do as well. So, but when you do that, you are then you're working at cross purposes. That constriction on land supply, almost at the same time that other aspects of livability are increasing, that people want to move to, say, for example, Oregon or specifically the Portland area, means that you're going to ration that supply with price. And another way to say it is that the value of all that amenity that you're creating is going to get capitalized in land value, and prices are going to go up. And you see the price of housing being greater than the cost of materials. And the reason it's so much greater is because that extra value is being capitalized into the land when land's getting expensive. So things work, and how has the UGB worked? There was a time, back in the, as the land use planning program was working, we went through a couple of different recessions, and bottomed out hard in the 80s, and then had another hard hit during the dot-com bust, and another one 5 or 6 years ago. And in the early ones, it looked like, is Portland ever going to recover? We got to start working on economic development. Everybody's going to leave, and nothing's ever going to happen here. And and at that point, I would say the urban growth boundary in most cities in Oregon, the boundaries did not bind. They were an idea. There weren't a lot of data when they were being set. There wasn't a lot of oversight when they were being set. Local jurisdictions did what they could. Some jurisdictions, either out of self-interest and cleverness, or just by doing what's easy, ended up with really big urban growth boundaries. And the urban growth boundaries, I'll say, did not bind. In other words, you could have an urban growth boundary, but it was like you didn't have an urban growth boundary because it was so much land, it didn't make any difference. It started to make a difference in Portland for sure in the mid-90s. And we did work for DLCD at that time, before there was, GIS was everywhere, trying to figure out whether you could see differences in the Portland metropolitan area, what was happening. And we found in that study that you were getting a lot more multifamily housing than the trend line was changing substantially. Multifamily housing was coming in. So your question was, are there any studies about having effects? That's one study, early study. The study I referred to earlier, the Lincoln Institute study, also did work on concentration of population and employment. And consistent with my previous assertion that what you measure is what you get, what they found was that in 7 of 8 states, you could find no data that suggested that that measures of concentration, either population per square mile or employment per square mile, was increasing in major cities in there. And the exception was Oregon. In Oregon, you could statistically see that we were getting more concentration. And we were getting that not because the market wanted it, because that's what was going on in the other 7 states. The market was doing what it wanted to do. In Oregon, we were telling the market, you simply won't be building on land outside of here, or not at any densities that are going to make a difference. So we got that densification, and I think that is a documentable, data-driven finding.
And that concentration was also studied with respect to whether it also brought about more increase in housing costs than in those states that didn't have it?
There's a debate here among people, certainly among people that want the Oregon land use program to have done only good things. But there's no debate among urban economists. They say, well, of course that's what you were going to get. You're going to get higher housing prices. The more subtle part of the debate was, at one point, this was going on 10 years ago, well, the prices are being driven by increased quality. And so, because we made things so much more livable, because we have transit and light rail, because we have parks, or whatever it is that we've done with the assistance of the planning program, because of all that, there's just more value, so people are willing to pay more for houses. It's difficult for me to separate out the demand side from the supply side. The two things are interacting, and what you've got, it may be that you're creating amenity, but at the same time, you're holding down supply. People see the amenity, they want to come to Portland either for the amenity, or even if it's not for the amenity, they want to come for jobs, or if it's not for jobs, they want to come because they want to retire, whatever it is. There's still a demand, and the housing supply, the land supply is more restricted. There's often the statement made back in the day, maybe still, was, well, multifamily housing is cheaper to build than single family housing. Again, come at it from an economics perspective, you got to get your terms right. A unit might be cheaper to build on a square foot basis. It's definitely more expensive to build. So you're asking people then to trade off a 1,500 square foot unit with, you know, green space around it and a garage for their car for a 650 square foot unit with no parking and no green space. So you've housed people in both cases, but you've housed them in very different ways and with very different benefits to them. Now, people may choose that, but the evidence is pretty clear from other places that if people can choose to have the amenity in a more expansive setting, they will do that. Anecdotal evidence, but we've done work in Texas, and Texas grows a lot faster than Oregon, but it does so without the same increase in housing prices. Now, I don't live in Texas, and I want to live in Texas, but that's one way to cope with the housing affordability problem.
Well, can you opine in, or have you actually studied and maybe stated this fact in the past? To what extent then can we say that the housing, quote, crisis, the housing crisis in Oregon is caused by or alleviated by or in some way changed by the Oregon planning program? I mean, in other words, right now we're having a lot of discussion about the housing crisis, but we've had such discussions in the past too. I certainly remember various time periods when this was a hot topic. What has been interesting to see is the degree to which we come to a consensus or don't about whether the land use program is causing this to such extent we should change something. In some cases we have made changes, many cases. Has the state been successful with its land use program in maybe alleviating that crisis, or did they cause it, or is it studied enough that we can even tell?
I think with questions like that, which I'm going to call complicated ones, because they require you to think about multiple systems, how they interact, you know, at both public and private sector. There are all kinds of external variables, et cetera. So let me just start from that point of view. But having said that, when you get in there and try to sort it out, it becomes very difficult. And here's just an example of the reasons. So the land use program, let's say the land use program says, and the only thing it says is we're going to have an urban growth boundary, and everything else is the same and up to cities. Well, if you do that, then you're going to restrict land supply. And so I've said, if that's the only thing you do, then you would expect that to increase the cost of housing. But then you say, well, you know, by restricting that land supply and putting an urban growth boundary up there, another thing that we did, and that we actually intended to do, was to force local jurisdictions to be smarter about their infrastructure costs. And so now, instead of, you know, extension out at the fringe, you know, we've got a more concentrated and a more developed network. And so that should be good, right? Then you take it the next step and say, well, but by doing that, you know, we could have had a different policy that said, instead of an urban growth boundary, we could have had a policy that said you were going to have to pay the full cost of services. And in other states, that's been called concurrency policy. And it has not worked very well. And it has not worked very well because the states didn't really have the muscle or really the will to enforce it. Because what it means is that you will get, in the short run, less economic growth than you want. Because if the pattern has been, we will subsidize that, we will build infrastructure on the backs of existing businesses and households. It's kind of a pay it forward thing, which is, they did it for me, I'll do it for you. And so now there's this cheap infrastructure. Cheap infrastructure you're going to build at the fringe. If you don't have that cheap infrastructure, then what do? And so I think that complicates the issue a lot in talking about, well, did the state cause it, or did the state policies cause it? They were a factor, but there are other things that could have been done that would have also been cause of that. If the state had said, no, we're going to have a full concurrency policy, you're going to have to pay for that, you would have, in effect, started to create an urban growth boundary, because nobody could have afforded to put lines a mile out, and at the same time, not only a full concurrency, and a simple policy that says, and new housing must be built to urban standards unless it's in rural zones. And so if you're building urban housing, you've got to build to urban standards, and now you're into streets and sidewalks and sewer and everything else. And the cost of that, if you're paying the full cost of it, you're talking, that's $100,000 a house or something like that, easily. And so how would people deal with that? Well, the way they dealt with it in Portland was by doing infill. And that was a desired policy. We wanted that infill. And they did it because then they didn't have to pay the system development charge, they didn't have to do anything else. And we saw what happened a few years ago when, coming out of the recession, the Metro made modest expansions to the urban growth boundary. Developers were seeing what was going on in Portland, seeing Portland prices, and went out and paid Portland prices for land in rural areas. And Washington County in particular said, after, when they came in for their development, said, well, I don't know how you think we're going to pay for those roads, but the way we think we're going to pay for them is we're going to have you pay for them. And all of a sudden, they were looking at system development charges instead of $5,000 for a system development charge for a lot for transportation. They were looking at $50,000. And at that point, they said, well, we can't build, and those issues are still being worked out.
So even without adopting a concurrency policy, the effect was to encourage that, certainly Washington County maybe.
Well, Washington County, implicitly, whether they adopted it or not, they implicitly threatened that they were going to have something that looked like a concurrency policy, because they couldn't figure out, justifiably, they couldn't figure out how to build these things. So we were doing planning out in those areas for, the urban reserve planning and getting complete communities and everything else, which developers might have been willing to build if they weren't on the hook for all the infrastructure. Obviously they were on the hook for the on-site infrastructure, but the larger collectors and the drainage that goes beyond was, those are major costs.
A lot of those costs are paid by, sometimes by the feds, sometimes by big bond measures and districts and everything else. Certainly the other states were doing the same thing. Had the same pressure to build infrastructure. Other states that you, for example, mentioned, we looked at 7 other states, and Oregon's planning program had better effects. And that was when I think you said it around 95. Where I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, Terry, is has it actually, to your opinion, has it been a beneficial policy, Goal 10 and the related planning policies? Would we have actually been better off without these policies? I mean, it's just another way of asking, has it worked? How well has it worked? Is this still a good thing? And in the end, do you have some thoughts about whether it was a good thing to pursue for Oregon?
Well, I think it's likely that I would say this, which is, I've been in planning for 40 years, so the idea that planning is inherently flawed and can never work would be a disappointing conclusion for me to come to at this point.
But of course, planning is different here because we have this program.
So I believe that markets fail. I believe in market forces. I think we get a lot of efficiency out of that. But I believe that markets maximize to a certain set of rules, and it is up to us as a society to be clear about what those rules are, what we want to achieve, and what we're going to allow market forces to decide on their own, and what we're going to say is going beyond the bounds. So, and we do that in a lot of ways. We have, at the federal level, we have Social Security program and other stuff because we don't want people falling that far off the map. So, and then we do it with local government policies as well, and state policies. So we have a state policy that says there are some boundaries on how land can develop in Oregon. And I think most people at the conceptual level would say, and I'll say most people, this isn't red and blue or conservative, and there are some environmental issues that, but for policy, would end up being bad. And we have all kinds of examples of that. The Willamette River, and salmon, it goes on and on, right? So some type of government policy that says you can't do that is probably a good idea. And even at a local level, where I'm buying in an urban area, I've got a house, and I know that there's going to be a little bit of noise, but the fact that that you've got a farm there and you're raising chickens at the same time, you're doing developing a firm that's going to do blasting caps. I want some protection against that, and so we set up rules that give us that protection. So there is a need for some government rule setting to set up those boundaries. The question then becomes for everybody is, okay, and just so easy to see, which is, on one hand, here's one example. I believe in those rules in general, but they can't possibly apply to my situation because my situation is so different.
You've run into this at local levels?
I run into it at local levels. I run into it myself when I'm trying to do stuff. I'm going, who made this rule?
Right.
And I go, oh, I did. So, you bump into that. And then there's, going farther, there's people that believe, independent of my ability, it's just we shouldn't have so many rules, to the very farthest end where we should have very few rules. So when you ask the question, is it a good program or has it achieved its benefits, it really does depend on your perspective and what you believe about those benefits. For me, the fact that I came to Oregon 40 or 50 years ago for what Oregon had to offer as a natural area. I was not attracted to its cities. I'm not saying its cities were unattractive, I just didn't think about things that way at that point. And the fact, as I've grown with Oregon, that Oregon is doing something more than many other states to protect those natural resources and that environmental quality, I support that. And to the extent that Oregon is doing things that are progressive in terms of how it's developing its cities and moving more toward different patterns of development, I support that. The question then becomes, are there ways that the program could get more of those things by being perhaps in some cases less regulatory and more incentivizing? And that's almost certainly true. But on the other hand, Oregon's problem is you don't need as much money for regulation as you do for incentivizing.
Well, you've probably got into I think, which is really sort of the cap of all these questions is, and so I'll just stop you for a second there, because I think this is where you're going, to address the perceived housing crisis, or maybe some other issues that are related to that. And you started off with incentives, but do you have some ideas on what should be different that would help us? So right now, there's a lot of people in the legislature tearing their hair out, trying to figure out how to address the housing crisis, and I'm sure there's plenty at the department too. I'm not involved in that, but how would you change it?
Well, now it was hard enough trying to remember what I did, but now it's made it even harder by asking me to figure out what the future should be.
Which I hope I'm not. I don't think that's what this is asking. It's just, do you have some ideas or some thoughts on what you might change?
Only conceptual, because I don't have a single dogmatic idea that says, if you did this policy, this would work. What I do think we could do, though, is to say, is this really an objective? And if it is an objective, let's look at all the things that affect it. And now let's deal with it as a whole and try to figure out, in a comprehensive way, how we are going to address this. So I'm not saying it's the right idea. I'm just saying I can see the evidence that it worked. It achieved its ends. The New Jersey program says we are going to have affordable housing. It doesn't say we're going to have multifamily housing. It says we're going to have affordable housing. And it says the way we're going to do that is, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, there are going to be requirements for developers to put in affordable housing. And once you set that up, then...
Such as inclusionary zoning or some other
right,
things.
Right. Then markets adjust to that reality. It takes a while, and there will be a downturn as people exit where they can at the margin. But eventually, if New Jersey is going to continue to be a state that is next to New York and has 100 Fortune 500 companies and et cetera, eventually you're going to build housing in New Jersey. And you're going to compete with people on a level playing field that has the same set of rules for everybody. Now, that takes money from somebody. It's taking money, presumably, from the people that are buying the more expensive housing. And it's either taking it from them directly as part of the development cost or the house purchase cost, or it's taking them, in other cases, by subsidies that the state's giving, in part by taxes on higher property or higher incomes. So there we are. I mean, that you have to make those decisions, decide what's important to you, what your social values are, and if you don't do that, you are left with a different set of social problems. You're left with whether it's directly causal or not, we do have problems with homelessness. You're certainly left with affordability problems. And those affordability problems can ripple out into the inability of moderate wage workers to get to places that need moderate wage workers, which then become economic problems. So that, my attitude toward that is, again, conceptually is, it would be nice to deal with that as a whole and think about the whole process and the policies that go with it. The difficulty with that, nice in theory, but in practice, what people want to do for understandable reasons is say, we need to fix the housing problem today. What single housing thing can we put in place? And either, I think Oregon is just strapped with its financial situation now, and that it's not going to be doing it with a lot of incentives. And so you had mentioned earlier, and I didn't mean to interrupt you when you started down that path. This started over by itself. I think it's still recording. I remember I mentioned that it had done that down there, and we're now at basically at 2 minutes. But the red dot is still on. I presume that it's just done it on its own. Yeah, sorry, I want to make sure that we weren't losing this. Okay.
So you had started to talk about incentives earlier, where that would be something you would inject more of into the Oregon program, or did I misinterpret what you said?
It really depends, Bob. I mean, if it is incentives, then from where does the money come, right? And so we got a transfer going on, and that means that somebody's got to give something up. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to charge higher income taxes? Are we going to charge higher income to shift more onto corporate, with the debate about whether we're going to then drive corporate out of here, and then we're going to have an economic downturn, and then we're going to be even worse off?
Well, there's also policy incentives. And so recently there was quite a bit of discussion around, for example, relaxing a certain policy. Maybe it's with respect to urban growth boundaries, for someone who's willing to develop affordable housing. So there's no money involved in that. Instead, there's essentially a waiver of a restriction as an example of an incentive for affordable housing. And
I travel a fair amount. I was going through the airport the other day, and I'm at TSA, and they're saying, well, and often for whatever reason I pass through the TSA line. Well, this time I didn't pass through the TSA line. So I'm in the regular line, and I'm going along, and there are a bunch of people grousing about how long it goes and everything else. And they said, well, you can buy something that will allow you to go through the TSA line faster. And I thought about that, and I said, this is wonderful. We have a policy that was put in place to deal with one thing a long time ago. It didn't do it well. It hasn't done it well since then. It is a dead weight drag on the economy to have all this going on. And now the bureaucracy has found a way to charge us, to relieve us from the duty to do something that we never wanted to do. So you have to be careful in this thing about saying, okay, we're going to waive restrictions. If you're going to waive those restrictions, did we really not need them to begin with? And if we didn't need them, why do we have them there? So, it's the same thing with transfer of development rights. We're going to pay for this with transfer of development rights. We go, so, and then the developers are going to buy these rights. And you go, well, what you got them is buying the rights to build more density. I thought we wanted more density. Why don't we just give them the rights to build more density? Well, and I think you have to think through that stuff you have to be pretty careful about that. And that is, I mentioned earlier the article on Zoned Out, that these regulations that we put in place that actually keep us, to some extent, from getting some of the objectives that we want. And I'm not saying it is that people are ignorant or evil when they're doing that. It's a complicated process, and you start with one idea and you say, okay, this will do it, and then you find the unintended consequences. So it's just a difficult process to lay out. And my attitude toward it is to just always try to be clear about where the money's coming from. Well, people say, well, we're going to bond it. Well, that's not where the money's coming from. Are we going to pay that bond back based on property tax? And if we are, what rates, whose property? Are we going to pay it with fees? Who's going to pay? And you just have to have an honest discussion about who's going to pay. And I think that's probably what we have to do in Oregon, which is if we have a housing problem, if we want more affordable housing, then and we still want urban growth boundaries, and we still want X, Y, and Z, then who's going to pay for the more affordable housing? Because the people that need it are not the ones that are going to pay.
So do we, I guess the two suggestions you had, one being that we might look at the New Jersey model and essentially mandate affordable housing to some extent, which is what inclusionary is. But the other one is more incentives, but of course it's either a money issue or some philosophical problems about adopting and then waiving regulations. Those seem to be sort of at odds with each other. We're either going to have a more mandatory program in order to try and address this housing issue with the New Jersey model, or less mandatory with more incentives. And I don't know, maybe there's some way to hold both of those thoughts in the same brain and do something. But I think it's probably the case that a lot of people are even today, right now, saying we have a housing crisis, but I think there's been some difficulty in getting consensus on a way to effectively address it.
No, I agree with you. It's difficult. And I said, essentially I said, a variation on follow the money. If if I'm right about the theory, and I may not be, the value is getting capitalized in the land. So it's not, it's not that developers, that all developers are getting extraordinarily rich. They're doing a development, they've got a rate of return that they're looking for. They're probably making that rate of return. In an informed market, where the value is increasing is in the land. And so it's the landowners that are getting the return. And many of us are landowners. The homeowners have a house, they want that land to increase in value, or especially if you've got a property that's vacant, and they feel entitled to that return. Even presumably the farmers who are in the urban reserve area believe that they have a right to, even though it's only $5,000 an acre now, they're thinking that it's going to be $500,000 an acre when it's time, and that that's theirs. Well, who's creating that value? And and how do we get a share of that back to be able to build the infrastructure that we need so that housing can be built, and maybe even to subsidize the cost of the structure itself so that we can build affordable housing. It requires pretty complicated, it requires some thinking about how to value capture, frankly, and that's where it is. You've got to figure out how to capture the value, because the public sector is doing a lot to create that value. That is not, and it's not just doing it by arbitrary regulation.
So to better understand this, what might be an example of a new policy or an amended policy that would start to do some of that?
Well, I mean, just an obvious one, as you bring in land into the urban growth boundary, you check what the value is outside the urban growth boundary, and you check what the value is inside the urban growth boundary, and you have some kind of estimate of the value of bringing that into the urban growth boundary.
And the public captures some of that for
Public
us.
captures some of that, right?
Can you jump in here for a moment?
Sure.
So did you talk about the 1970s discussion about windfalls and wipeouts? The notion that...
We haven't touched on that yet.
The notion of, for example, taxing land within the urban growth boundaries much more heavily than land outside, and vice versa, buildings and land.
No,
Those were on the agenda back in the day.
yeah, and where we started size, I read that book when I was in graduate school, but I wasn't around trying to implement that book when the program was being put together.
And I wasn't around when the program was being put together either. I don't know whether, we obviously never got that policy built into the program. Did it just die because of too much controversy or for other reasons?
Well, I think it was never about to be born, but at the ideal level, planners were definitely talking about it. And yes, there was a lot of discussion about windfall and wipeout and value capture back in the early mid-1970s. And for example, the CRAG planners made it very clear we need both some form of tax-based sharing at the regional level, which had recently been started in Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Right. That's what we come back to, the one place that seems to be
One
doing
place which managed to do that, and then this notion of taxing land, the old Henry George notion of taxing land much more heavily than buildings, where we want to encourage increasing the supply of buildable land. So the CRAG planners, again, back in the mid-1970s, were saying that's absolutely critical to an effective regional planning program.
Yeah.
Is it any less controversial today if we were to try to to go down those lines
Oh, no,
back then? I don't
Good
know.
question.
No, I mean, it comes up in pieces. It came in, aside, came up, you know, that value capture showed up a lot during the days of the early light rail. And,
Yes.
back in the UMTA days, and then a
Yes.
little bit with FTA of trying, and there it was, you know, it just seemed like, to me, kind of a logical way to look at it and say, okay, state agencies or federal agencies, put your money where your mouth is. You know, you're saying that this transit or this, you know, this light rail or subway or whatever you're going to put in is going to create a lot of value. Find a way to, you know, to get some of that land,
Yes.
land bank it,
Yes.
and in some cases that happened. And
Yes.
even where it didn't happen,
Yes.
what did occur is it just took a long time. What was predicted eventually occurred. The predictions were bad because they said it'll happen in 5 years, and it took 20 years.
Right.
But it did happen, and when it happened, then there was a lot of value there. And, you know, if the public sector were then getting that value because they own that land, because they got that as part of the deal for putting the infrastructure in, you know, then there's a way to get at that. But now, Bob, I mean, that is such a hard issue, and it's such a, you know, in these times, you know.
I think it's harder now than it might have been, but I would be uninformed because I don't, like I say, you were talking about a conversation that happened before I was on the scene, and maybe it was immensely controversial even then, and
Yes.
that's part of the
Yes.
problem, is it always will be. Although, you know, maybe I'm too idealistic, but I often think that there's some solutions in these broad ideas that seem really controversial, but there's some magic bullet somewhere where you can think of a way to do it, which people would, that's just, we haven't tried yet. You know, have we tried to come up with some way to start somehow capturing the value of value added for putting land in the urban growth boundaries? Maybe it's just so simple as, you know, as a particular city sort of spearheading it, you know, leading the way and coming up with something that works. I don't know, and still have yet to see it. We haven't really talked about any of that, Terry. Well, I think we're at the end, but I mean, there was certainly a lot of your own experiences that we didn't have time to get to here today. Particular issues, housing and others, in your long history. Are there any that we want to make sure we document, or that you think bringing them up would inform this conversation more? Because you've worked with how many? Probably, I don't know, even hundreds of different planning projects in your time?
Yeah, probably, I don't know, I think I've probably managed 700 projects.
700. And I mean, some of those were buildable lands inventories, and some of them were probably...
not all on buildable land stuff, but yeah. So that, I don't know about where, I think where I get to on this, I mean, maybe just a couple of points. The one is that just the politics of it. I think there are lots of ways for a city or for a region to become a good region. And you could have, you know, a Houston mentality of things and say, you know, we're going to be the best place for economic development, and here's what we're going to do, and we're going to get all this growth, and because of that growth, we're going to leverage that and do this and that. And if you got everybody there saying, that's what we're going to do, you're probably going to be successful at that. Now, you're going to get other stuff happening. But then, and you could be a different kind of city, and you could say, okay, we're going to be the smart growth place, and we're going to take care of the environment, we're going to go slow, we're going to do this. And you live with the fact that you are not as attractive for economic development, that you're not giving incentives, and yet you kind of bump along and you don't collapse, and you say, and then you watch and you say, in about 10 years, after they're done fouling the nest over here, and we have all our infrastructure in place, we've got, you know, a beautiful community, rules that are going to keep those businesses from having their environment distorted by new businesses that come in. There are businesses that then will say, well, that's a good place, and in fact, that now is a good deal. And you can go that way. Where you can't go well is when you have both of those things going on at the same time, and you are continually moving from, one set of policies to the other as the economic climate and political climate change, and you never settle down to who you are. And I think that is, that's a problem for all cities, but it certainly is a problem for cities in Oregon. And when you're on that counter-cyclical part, it's almost like you're always doing the wrong thing. You're in an economic boom and you're trying to stop it, and then you're in a recession and you're trying to grow, and so you're constantly putting policy and you're just you're always reacting to what just happened, and the recession is just over the hill, and now you're putting all your money into economic incentives and you're overstimulating the housing market and just making the cliff a little bit steeper. So getting a coherence to policy, dealing with everything all together, to me that's been the interesting part of planning in Oregon. We have, at the base we've got the 14 goals, and each of them is a separate thing, and you could, to use the cliche, you can think of those as almost silos, and anybody can pick the goal they want and focus on that goal. And the hope is that by having enough people working on all the pieces, that eventually there's some democratic conjoining that leads to the best solution. But another way to think about it is, it doesn't make any difference what door you come through, you're going to be in the same room. And whether you enter through the door of transportation or economic development or land use or urban growth boundaries or housing, you can't solve any of these problems without solving all of them. I mean, at least without addressing all of them. We just, I'd say, that's one of my observations, again and again. That does get to the idea that is at the heart of the statewide land use planning program, and it's something that it still says, and I still believe, which is fundamentally we're telling local governments that integrated comprehensive planning is a good idea.
Right.
So do it.
Right. And I've heard it said, people forget that this is a, quote, comprehensive land use program. And in fact, I even heard somebody react saying, people saying it's a planning program, but there's a lot of planning, but comprehensive planning is different. And I think that's what you just said, is that's a real good thing, and it is at the heart of it.
Here's one, Bob. You may have asked me this question, but if you didn't, it reminds me of a question that I can't answer. and that is, what could the state do? I'm working for a city now where, a big city, where it has not really updated its comprehensive plan in maybe 20 years. And one of the reasons it hasn't is because it is so hard in Oregon to get through that process. And as a result, it has citizens that, as we're trying to do, we're not even doing a land use planning process, we're doing a citywide strategic plan. And what we came to as one of the fundamental things we said is, you can't get a strategic plan done because you have no agreement on physically what this city should look like. You have people saying, you've got an urban growth boundary, but you've got people saying that we don't want any growth. You've got people saying that we're not going to build any bridges because we don't need them, and you've got other people saying, but all of your land is on the other side of the river. So, no wonder you've got such confusion here about this. So, but in the end, what we recommended was essentially something outside of the Oregon land use process, which was just spend 6 months on a quick, get people involved and do a visioning process. Don't call it a comprehensive plan. Just get people on the same page and understanding the kind of trade-offs that they've got here. And if you can get through that, then maybe you can spend the time to codify it, to get through, a comprehensive planning process. But that, hadn't
Is
seen
it a
that.
little bit of returning to basics? Back in the 70s, you know, people talked about the planning program, the Oregon land use program was very goal oriented, and there are people who have observed that today there are so many hard and fast rules that it's hard to see the broader, let's just have a broad set of goals that we're trying to achieve. And I think what you're saying is that if you do a strategic plan in a community, if your community can reach agreement on a sort of broad set of goals outside of the land use program, you have essentially done something that maybe was in the early days envisioned for the Oregon land use program, which was a broad goal setting exercise about some silos. You know, how is the city going to address transportation? How's it going to address housing? How's it going to address farmland? And I think what you're saying is that after you're done with that, if you can achieve that, you're a long way toward then doing the more formal process, which of course has many legal and other kinds of hurdles that you're going to face in the Oregon process.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. It reminded me of one more anecdote. I mentioned that I worked with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. At one point, they, for reasons that not clear to them or not clear to me, they invited me to go to China with a delegation to work over there. And I go, well, what am I going to tell people in China? And so I'm talking to the Pampa planners at Beijing about, you know, their urban issues. And I trotted out, you know, a plan that I'd worked on for a city of, you know, 15,000, 20,000 in Oregon. And I said, let me just explain this pretty quickly. Here's all the land. Here's the land that you can't build on very economically. Oh, here's the land that you can't build on because you can't build on it. It's water, or it's a steep slope or something like that. Here's the land that you can't build on because you don't want to build on it because you want to protect it. And here's the land that you can't build on because it's already developed. So here's the land that you have left. And here's the land that you've got developed. And so what you're trying to do is to figure out how you take what you have, protect, you know, decide what you want to protect for environmental and cultural and social reasons, and work with the rest of it in a way that makes sense. And typically the way that makes sense is if you're trying to work on land use and transportation at the same time, every city I've ever worked in always comes up with nodes and noodles. I mean, there's going to be nodes here, and there's going to be a transit corridor in between them, and we're going to connect them that way. So nodes and noodles is probably where you're going to go to. So that's fine. And at the end, here's the ironic part. You know, 3 people came up and they go, you know, oh, Mr. Moore, thank you very much. You know China so well. I don't know a thing about China, but apparently it must be the same everywhere.
It resonated, huh?
I'm sure it is. It's funny, we don't have a nodes and noodles goal, do we?
Well, yeah.
But so many people have done it.
Yeah, but it, you know, when you think about it, you kind of go, well, I mean, it's basic. It fits with everything. It fits with what people want. It's basic urban economics. Some places are going to get more concentrated. Well, you know that whole story.
So, Terry, we're I think at the end of our time, and oh, go ahead.
I have a specific interest if you haven't covered it yet. It's about ECONorthwest and its role, and a little more generally the role of an economist perspective on the evolution of the program. Because it seems to me that the organization is, in its own way, somewhat similar to 1,000 Friends. I'm also really interested in the role, for example, that hearings officers have played, especially at the LSCD, because that's an interesting twist. But the organization, I think, has been very important. So I really appreciate observations. You, Ed Whitelaw, Russ Beaton.
Well, I guess what I would say, Cy, is when back to my point a few minutes ago, which is you got to deal with everything. And if you have to deal with everything, it means that you have to deal with, you need people that understand land use, and then you start cutting that and go, what are the parts of land use? Well, there are designers, and so we need those people. There are planners, and then there are different systems that have to be in there. And you also have to deal with economic development, which is one aspect of what economists do. But there's another piece that cuts across everything, which is, in a sense, some type of rigorous thinking about the pros and cons of these various decisions, how urban systems work together, and how those systems create urban economies, which are essential to having an urban area. So I think there is a contribution to be made, and for us at ECONorthwest, we are just fortunate to be in Oregon that was not recognized that in part through Goal 9, but more importantly, as we're dealing with Goal 10, Goal 14, and other things, there are just increasingly, you watch that evolution to how much more economics got brought into the decision-making process. So it's, I would say, in 1970s, I don't know who was doing market analysis to think about public policy, but now it's an inevitable part of public policy, which is what is the market response to this going to be, and what would the market do if we don't do anything, what would we do if we do these other things. So there's a contribution to be made there, and that we've been fortunate to be able to play that role here and in a few other places. But it is one role among many that needs to be played. So you've got all these actors with different interests in there that are all part of the picture.
But your firm has been at the center of a lot of really large land use planning issues, analyses, planning, inventory, whatever, or pieces of that. Ultimately, the point being that a major player in the Oregon land use planning system.
Well, we've had some involvement. I mean, major player, I don't know, not like
700 studies you've been involved with. You've done multiple plans, you and members of your firm, certainly Ed Whitelaw and others. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that is
really interesting, I think.
Piece of the history.
Yeah, well, and there are other parts, a little bit outside of that. My partner Ed Whitelaw was heavily involved for years on pretty much all the environmental issues in Oregon, all the spotted owl issues and things like that had ended up having a pretty major influence on the way things went.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, good. I think we're out of time. I want to make sure that there wasn't something that you really wanted to say for history here that for some reason we didn't get to, but
No.
if not, I think we'll.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
This was fun. I got to hear what I think.
And you can always play it back if you forget.